There's a place in Tennessee where candy built a kingdom. Not the kind of kingdom you read about in fairy tales, but something darker, stranger, and far more human. In the rolling hills of Giles County, hidden among ancient oak trees and morning mist that rises from the earth like whispered secrets, stands what remains of a dream that turned into a monument of loneliness. They called it Milky Way Farm, and for a brief, shining moment in the 1930s, it was the most expensive private estate in the entire state of Tennessee. But the man who built it, Frank C. Mars, would barely live to see it finished. And the son he built it for, the son he wanted desperately to impress, the son whose approval meant more than all the candy bars in America, would never call it home. This is a story about wealth and poverty, about fathers and sons, about the things money can buy and the things it cannot. This is the story of how chocolate and caramel built a palace, and how that palace became a tomb for dreams that died before they could bloom. Picture this. It's 1934, the heart of the Great Depression. The country is broken, bleeding from economic wounds that seem impossible to heal. In cities across America, men who once wore suits to office jobs now stand in soup lines, their eyes hollow with shame and hunger. Banks have collapsed, taking life savings with them. Factories stand silent, their machines rusting, their workers scattered to the winds. On the Great Plains, dust storms turn day into night, choking the life from the land, forcing families to abandon farms their grandparents had built with their own hands. Children go to bed hungry. Mothers water down soup to make it stretch another day. The very fabric of American prosperity has torn apart, and people wonder if it will ever be sewn back together. Yet, in the middle of all this suffering, in the rolling green hills of Giles County, Tennessee, a mansion rises. Not just any mansion. A sprawling estate covering nearly 3,000 acres, complete with a Tudor-style manor house that looks like it was transported from the English countryside. The finest horse barns in the entire South, built to standards that would make European nobility envious, and enough luxury to make even the wealthiest families of Newport and Palm Beach jealous. The whole project costs over $500,000. A sum so staggering that most Americans cannot even comprehend it. To put it in perspective, at a time when the average worker makes less than $1,500 a year, when families lose their homes over debts of a few $100s, Frank Mars is spending enough money to change thousands of lives. He could feed entire towns. He could save struggling businesses. But instead, he's building a dream in stone and wood, creating something beautiful in the midst of national despair. And behind it all stands a man who started with nothing, who once slept in train stations because he couldn't afford a room, who sold candy door to door just to eat, who limped through life with a body damaged by childhood disease, a man who built an empire from chocolate and caramel, who turned a single candy bar into a fortune that most could only dream of, who climbed from the very bottom of American society to stand at its peak. Frank Clarence Mars has everything, wealth beyond measure, a business that thrives while others collapse, a name that everyone knows. But money, as Frank Mars would learn in the cruelest way possible, cannot buy the thing he wanted most: the love and respect of his only son. Frank Clarence Mars was born on September 7, 1883, in a small Minnesota town called Hancock, a place where winter came early and stayed late, where the wind cut through clothing like knives of ice. From the very beginning, life dealt him a difficult hand, the kind of hand that breaks most people before they learn to play it. He suffered from polio as a child, a disease that struck without warning and left destruction in its wake. The illness ravaged his small body, leaving him with a permanent limp that would mark every step he took for the rest of his life. While other children ran through fields, climbed trees, played rough games in dusty streets, Frank could only watch from windows, his legs too weak to carry him into the world of childhood joy. His mother, Alva, became his whole world during those long, painful days that stretched into months and years. She was a woman of limited education but unlimited love, someone who refused to let her son's disability define his future. She would sit beside him for hours in their modest kitchen, the smell of sugar and chocolate filling the small space, steam rising from pots on the wood-burning stove. She taught him to make chocolate candies, showing him how to mix ingredients with patient hands, how to judge temperature by feel and instinct, how to press flavors together until they became something new, something magical. It was a simple skill, something to pass the time, something to give the boy a sense of purpose when his body wouldn't let him run free with other children, when he couldn't do the things that boys were supposed to do. But in those quiet afternoons, in that humble kitchen that smelled of caramel and cocoa and his mother's gentle presence, something took root in young Frank's heart. A love for candy that went beyond taste or profit. He loved the alchemy of it. The way simple ingredients could transform into something that made people smile, that brought joy to their faces, that turned ordinary moments into small celebrations. He loved the precision required, the way you had to pay attention to every detail or risk ruining the batch. Most of all, he loved what candy represented: sweetness in a hard world, pleasure that anyone could afford, a moment of happiness that didn't require wealth or status or a body that worked the way it should. When Frank grew old enough to work, when childhood finally released him into the harsh world of adulthood, he didn't have many options. His disability made physical labor difficult, nearly impossible. Factories wouldn't hire someone who couldn't stand for 12-hour shifts. Farms had no use for a man who couldn't lift hay bales or plow fields. His family had no money for higher education, no connections to open doors that might otherwise remain closed. So he did what he knew, the only thing his mother's love had prepared him for. He made candy. At first, it was just small batches sold at local shops and markets, carried from store to store in a worn leather satchel, each piece wrapped carefully in paper, each sale celebrated like a small victory. He married young, 19 years old and full of hope, to a woman named Ethel Kissack, who saw past his limp to the determination beneath. Together they tried to build a life, renting a small apartment, dreaming of the business they would create, the family they would raise. In 1910, their son Forrest was born, a healthy, energetic boy who cried loudly and kicked strongly, who would grow up to be everything his father wasn't. Strong where Frank was weak, aggressive where Frank was gentle, ambitious in ways that bordered on ruthless, driven by hunger that never seemed satisfied. But before Forrest could even form memories of his father, before the boy could say his first words or take his first steps, Frank and Ethel's marriage fell apart. The details were never made public, locked away behind closed doors and whispered arguments. Perhaps Ethel grew tired of poverty, of watching her husband limp from store to store selling penny candies while their rent went unpaid. Perhaps Frank's dedication to his work left no room for the attention a wife deserved. Perhaps they simply discovered, as so many young couples do, that love alone cannot overcome fundamental incompatibility. Whatever the reason, the result was clear and devastating. Ethel took Forrest and left, moving back to her family, eventually remarrying a man with a steady job and a healthy body. Frank was alone again. Just him and his candy. Just him and the memories of a son who would grow up calling another man father. The early years after the divorce were brutal. A kind of poverty that goes beyond mere lack of money. Frank moved from town to town, setting up small candy businesses that would succeed for a while, then fail when money ran short or competition grew fierce or luck simply ran out. He sold candies from a cart on street corners, standing for hours despite the pain in his legs, smiling at customers while his body screamed for rest. He worked in other people's factories, making candy to someone else's specifications, watching his creative ideas dismissed by bosses who cared only about profit margins. He slept in train stations when he couldn't afford a room, curling up on hard wooden benches, his coat pulled tight against the cold, his stomach empty more often than full. There were nights, long, dark nights when sleep wouldn't come, when he must have wondered if his mother's lessons in that Minnesota kitchen had been nothing more than a cruel tease, a skill that would never amount to anything real, a passion that would lead only to suffering and failure. There were mornings when he woke stiff and sore, his limp more pronounced, his hope fading, when quitting seemed like the only sane choice. But Frank Mars had something that no amount of hardship could break, a stubbornness that ran deeper than bone, a refusal to quit that bordered on insanity. And somewhere in the back of his mind, always, like a wound that never quite healed, was the thought of Forrest. The son he barely knew. The boy being raised by another man in another house, learning to live without the father who'd failed him. The child he wanted desperately, impossibly, to prove himself to. In 1911, Frank remarried. Her name was Ethel Veronica Healy, and unlike his first wife, she believed in him. Not just in his candy, but in the man himself. She saw past the limp, past the failures, past the string of businesses that had crumbled. She saw the spark of genius in how he combined flavors, how he understood what people wanted before they knew it themselves. Together, they moved to Tacoma, Washington, and started the Morrow Bar Company. It was a small operation, barely more than a kitchen setup, but it was theirs. And slowly, painfully, it began to grow. Frank created the Morrow Bar, a chocolate and caramel combination that sold better than anything he'd made before. Money started coming in, not a fortune, but enough. Enough to eat, enough to dream. But Frank wanted more than success. He wanted his son. Forrest was growing up without him, being raised by Ethel Kissack and her new husband in the Minneapolis area. The boy knew Frank existed, but barely remembered him. Letters went unanswered. Visits were awkward and strained. Forrest was becoming his own person, shaped by a different household, different values, different dreams, and the distance between father and son grew wider with each passing year, a gap that no amount of candy or money seemed able to bridge. By the time Forrest was a teenager, Frank had moved his operation to Minneapolis, partly for business, but mostly to be near his son. He wanted a relationship. He wanted to be a father, even if he'd missed the chance to be a dad. But Forrest was already hardening into the man he would become. Brilliant, yes, driven, absolutely, but also cold, calculating, someone who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, success and failure, winners and losers. When Forrest graduated from high school, Frank offered him a job, not out of charity, but because he genuinely believed his son had talent. And Forrest did work for the Mars Company for a time. But the two men clashed constantly. Frank was creative, intuitive, someone who trusted his gut about flavors and marketing. Forrest was analytical, ruthless, Someone who believed in data and efficiency and squeezing every penny of profit from every transaction. They fought about everything. How to run the business, how to treat employees, where to expand, what risks to take. The fights grew louder, more bitter, until finally something broke that could never be repaired. It happened in 1932. The exact words exchanged that day have been lost to time, but the outcome is clear. Frank Mars told his son to leave, not just leave the office, but leave the company entirely. Forrest, proud and furious, didn't argue. He took his inheritance, a small sum and the foreign rights to make Milky Way bars in Europe, and he left America entirely. He went to England and built his own candy empire, one that would eventually grow to rival and even surpass his father's. But in that moment of departure, both men lost something they would never get back. Frank lost his son, and Forrest lost his father. What remained between them was a wound that would never heal, a silence that would stretch across oceans and years. After Forrest left, Frank threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The Mars Company was thriving. The Milky Way bar, introduced in 1923, had become one of the best-selling candy bars in America. Snickers followed in 1930. Three Musketeers would come in 1932. Frank was rich now, truly wealthy in a way he'd never imagined during those hungry years sleeping in train stations. But wealth without someone to share it with, without the approval of the one person whose opinion mattered most, felt hollow. He'd built an empire, but he'd lost his family. And so he decided to build something else, something grand, something that would prove to Forrest, or maybe just to himself, that Frank Mars was more than a candy maker. He was a man of vision, of culture, of refinement. He found the land in Giles County, Tennessee, not far from the town of Pulaski, a place where the hills rolled gentle and green, where morning mist gathered in the valleys like pools of silver, where the soil was rich and the water ran clear. Nearly 3,000 acres of rolling hills, fertile soil perfect for growing anything you could imagine, and quiet beauty that seemed untouched by the suffering happening elsewhere in America. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an odd choice for a candy magnate. Tennessee wasn't known for candy manufacturing. It was far from the Mars Company's headquarters in Chicago, far from the markets and distribution centers that kept business flowing. The land was beautiful, yes, but impractical. But Frank wasn't thinking about business logistics or profit margins. He was thinking about legacy, about permanence, about creating something that would last beyond candy bars and quarterly reports. He wanted to create an estate, a working farm that would showcase the finest of everything America and Europe had to offer. The best horses, animals so magnificent that people would travel hundreds of miles just to see them. The best cattle, bloodlines traced back through generations of careful breeding. The best architecture, combining old-world elegance with new-world innovation. A place that would bear his name and prove his worth long after the candy bars were eaten and forgotten, long after he was dust, long after everyone who'd ever doubted him was gone. Construction began in 1933, and from the very start, it was clear that this would be no ordinary farm. Frank hired the finest architects, men who'd studied in Europe and understood how to create buildings that looked like they'd stood for centuries even when they were brand new. He brought in craftsmen from across America and beyond, stonecutters who could shape granite into art, carpenters who knew how to make wood sing, metalworkers who could bend iron into flowing curves. He studied the great estates of England and Europe, poring over books and photographs late into the night, marking pages, making notes, imagining how each element might work in the Tennessee landscape. The manor houses where old money lived in quiet elegance, where history hung in every corner and tradition governed every detail. He wanted that same feeling, that same sense of permanence and class, transplanted to the American South, made new again for a new era. The main house would be Tudor style, inspired by the English country estates of the 15 and 1600s. Distinctive half-timbering in dark wood against pale stucco walls. Steep gabled roofs that shed rain like water off a duck's back. Tall chimneys in brick that seemed to reach toward the clouds themselves, announcing the presence of the house long before you could see its doors. Inside, there would be carved wood paneling in the finest oak, brought from forests where trees had grown for a century before being cut. Imported marble from Italy for the fireplaces, veined and colored in ways that American stone could never match. Hand-painted tile work in the bathrooms, each tile a tiny work of art, and every modern convenience money could buy, electric lights throughout, running water to every room, central heating for cold Tennessee winters, telephones connecting the estate to the outside world. But the house, magnificent as it would be, was only the beginning of Frank's vision. He had fallen in love with draft horses, those massive, powerful animals that had pulled plows and wagons and artillery since before machines changed the world forever. Clydesdales with their distinctive white-feathered feet and gentle eyes, Percherons, gray as storm clouds and twice as powerful, Belgians with their golden coats gleaming in the sun. These gentle giants represented something deep to Frank, something he couldn't quite put into words but felt in his bones. Strength without arrogance, beauty in service, power that didn't need to dominate, nobility that didn't require titles or wealth to prove itself. So he built barns for his horses that were finer than most people's homes, structures that would make established horse breeders weep with envy. The main horse barn was a masterpiece, a long, elegant building with a center aisle so wide that full-sized carriages could drive through without touching the walls. The floor was laid in brick in a herringbone pattern, each brick set by hand, creating a surface that was beautiful and practical, easy to clean and safe for horses to walk on. Each stall was spacious and clean, 8 feet by 10 feet of personal space for each magnificent animal, far larger than standard horse stalls. Imported fittings from England, brass feed bowls and water buckets that gleamed like gold, leather halters soft as butter and strong as steel. Careful ventilation with windows positioned to catch every breeze, keeping the air fresh even in the heat of summer. The tack room gleamed with polished leather and brass, rows of saddles and bridles and harnesses, each piece maintained to perfection, each one representing hours of careful craftsmanship. Outside, white fenced paddocks stretched across the hills like pieces of a giant chessboard, dividing the land into perfect sections where horses could graze and run and play. The fences weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Each board painted brilliant white. Each post set exactly the right distance from the next, creating lines that seemed to flow across the landscape like rivers of snow. But Frank didn't stop with horses. He brought in prize-winning cattle, chickens, and hogs. He planted orchards and vegetable gardens. He built silos and equipment sheds and workers' cottages. He created a dairy that produced milk and butter for the estate and the surrounding community. Every building, every fence, every gate was built to the highest standard. White paint gleamed in the Tennessee sun. Stone walls stood straight and true. Even the workers' housing was comfortable and well-maintained, far better than what most farm laborers could expect in the 1930s. Frank wanted perfection. He wanted a place that would make people stop and stare, that would make them say, "This is what success looks like. This is what a man can build when he refuses to quit." As construction continued through 1933 and into 1934, word spread about the mysterious candy millionaire building a palace in the Tennessee hills. Reporters came from Nashville and Memphis, their cameras clicking, their notepads filling with descriptions that sounded like fiction. Photographers captured images of the rising manor house with its distinctive Tudor facades, of the magnificent barns that looked more like cathedrals than farm buildings, of workers swarming across the property like ants building a colony. The local newspapers ran stories with headlines that mixed wonder and confusion. Why would a man build such luxury in the middle of nowhere? Why Tennessee instead of New York or California? Why now, when the country was on its knees? Local people found work on the estate, grateful for jobs during the Depression when work was scarce and hope even scarcer. They came from towns like Pulaski and Lawrenceburg, from tiny communities scattered across Giles County, men who'd lost their farms or factories, who'd been wandering in search of employment, who'd begun to think they might never work again. Frank paid them fair wages, better than fair, and he paid on time, every week without fail. In a world where employers were cutting wages and delaying payments, where desperate men would work for almost nothing, Frank's generosity seemed almost incomprehensible. Frank moved through the construction site daily despite his limp, despite the pain that came from too much walking on uneven ground. He would arrive each morning as the sun rose, watching the mist burn off the hills, seeing his dream take shape in the golden light. He checked every detail, running his hands over stonework, testing doors to make sure they hung straight, examining paint to ensure it matched his vision exactly. He'd pull out crumpled sketches from his pockets, drawings he'd made late at night, ideas that had come to him in dreams. "Can we add another window here?" he'd ask the foreman. "Can we raise this wall another foot? Can we make this curve just a bit more elegant?" The workers grew to respect him, this limping man who clearly knew nothing about construction but everything about quality, who could spot a crooked board from 20 yards away, who noticed when someone was cutting corners or doing sloppy work. He wasn't cruel about it, didn't shout or threaten. He'd just call the man over, point out the problem, and say quietly, "We can do better than this." And somehow, that gentle correction hurt worse than any yelling, made men want to prove themselves to this strange, driven, oddly kind boss who was building a monument in the middle of nowhere. They began to understand, though Frank never said it directly, that he wasn't building this estate for himself. Every decision he made, every detail he obsessed over, seemed aimed at impressing someone. Someone who wasn't there. Someone whose absence hung over the whole project like a ghost. When workers asked about it during lunch breaks, speculating in low voices, the older ones who'd been around longer would shake their heads and say, "It's for his son. Everything's for his son." But the son never came to visit, never inspected the progress, never seemed to care about the palace rising in his honor. By 1934, the estate was largely finished. The manor house stood complete, its Tudor facades reflecting in the pond that had been dug nearby, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, its chimneys trailing gentle smoke from fires lit to test the fireplaces. The horse barns were full of magnificent animals, their coats brushed to a shine that made them glow like living sculptures, their stalls cleaned daily by workers who took genuine pride in their work. The cattle grazed peacefully in emerald fields, prize-winning bloodlines brought from across America and Europe, animals worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The orchards were planted and beginning to grow, young trees full of promise, their branches reaching toward the sky. Frank had even installed a complete water system, engineering a network of pipes and pumps that brought running water to every building on the property, an incredible luxury for a rural Tennessee farm in the 1930s, when most country places still relied on wells and outhouses. He'd built something remarkable, something that would have been impressive in any era, but seemed almost miraculous during the Great Depression, when the country was broken and bleeding, when hope seemed in short supply. Milky Way Farm represented everything America wanted to believe about itself. That hard work could lead to success, that anyone could rise, that dreams, no matter how grand, could become real. But there was an emptiness at the heart of it all, a void that no amount of beauty or luxury could fill. Frank would walk through his magnificent barns in the evening, running his hand along the smooth wood of the stalls, breathing in the smell of hay and horses and leather. He'd stand in his manor house, surrounded by fine furniture and imported art, watching the sun set through tall windows, painting the Tennessee hills in shades of gold and purple. And he'd feel the silence pressing in, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. He'd written to Forrest dozens of times, long letters that tried to explain what he was building and why, letters that asked in carefully chosen words if Forrest might consider visiting, just for a weekend, just to see what had been created. The letters came back unanswered, or returned responses so brief and cold they might as well have been form letters. Forrest was in England now, building his own empire in Europe, proving that he didn't need his father's help or approval or love. He had the foreign rights to manufacture Milky Way bars, the gift Frank had given him when they'd parted ways, and he was using those rights to build a business that would eventually span continents. He was making his own fortune, his own name, his own legacy. And he was doing it without Frank, which seemed to be the whole point. The statement he'd been trying to make since he was old enough to understand that his father had failed him when it mattered most. But time was running short, though Frank didn't know it yet, or perhaps knew it better than anyone, and refused to admit it. His health, never robust since childhood polio had ravaged his young body, was beginning to fail in ways that couldn't be ignored. The stress of building the empire, the heartbreak of losing Forrest, the endless hours of work that stretched from dawn until long past midnight, all of it was taking a toll that showed in his face, in his labored breathing, in the way he'd pause halfway upstairs and grip the railing until the tightness in his chest passed. He felt tired more often, a deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. His breathing became labored after even short walks, his lips sometimes turning bluish when he pushed himself too hard. Doctors visited the estate, called in by worried staff members who noticed their employer growing weaker, who saw him clutching his chest in private moments when he thought no one was watching. The doctors examined him, listened to his heart with stethoscopes, asked questions about his symptoms, and gave their diagnosis in carefully chosen words. His heart was failing, worn out by decades of stress and struggle, damaged beyond repair by the life he'd lived. They told him to slow down, to rest, to stop working himself into the ground. They said if he didn't change his ways, didn't take care of himself, he wouldn't see another year. But Frank had no intention of slowing down. Not when his dream was so close to completion, not when Milky Way Farm was almost ready to welcome the world. Not when he was so close to creating something that might finally make Forrest understand. If he couldn't have his son's love, perhaps he could at least have his respect. Perhaps seeing what Frank had built, seeing the vision made real, would crack the ice that had formed between them, would create an opening for reconciliation, for forgiveness, for a relationship that existed on something other than resentment and disappointment. By 1934, the estate was largely finished. The manor house stood complete, its Tudor facades reflecting in the pond that had been dug nearby. The horse barns were full of magnificent animals, their coats brushed to a shine, their stalls cleaned daily by workers who took pride in their work. The cattle grazed peacefully. The orchards were planted and beginning to grow. Frank had even installed a complete water system, bringing running water to every building on the property, an incredible luxury for a rural Tennessee farm in the 1930s. He'd built something remarkable, something that would have been impressive in any era, but seemed almost miraculous during the Great Depression. But there was an emptiness at the heart of it all. Frank would walk through his magnificent barns and see no one to share them with. He'd stand in his manor house, surrounded by fine furniture and imported art, and feel the silence pressing in. He'd written to Forrest, asking him to come see what had been built, hoping that maybe, just maybe, his son would be impressed, would understand what all this meant. But Forrest was in England, building his own empire, proving that he didn't need his father's help or approval. The letters went unanswered, or when Forrest did reply, the words were cold, formal, the kind of thing you'd write to a business acquaintance, not to your father. The grand opening of Milky Way Farm came in the fall of 1934. Frank invited dignitaries, business associates, and local officials. They came in cars and carriages, driving up the long entrance road, lined with newly planted trees. They gasped at the barns, admired the horses, toured the manor house with its polished wood and gleaming fixtures. They ate food prepared in the estate's kitchens and drank toasts to Frank Mars, the Candy King who'd built a kingdom. Newspapers covered the event, describing it as one of the finest estates in the South, a testament to American ingenuity and success. Frank smiled for the photographs. He shook hands and accepted congratulations. But if you looked closely at the pictures from that day, you might notice something in his eyes. A sadness. A longing for the one person who wasn't there. That winter, Frank's health worsened rapidly. He'd been feeling unwell for months, but he'd pushed through, telling himself it was just fatigue, just the normal tiredness that comes from working too hard. But it was more than that. His heart was failing, worn out by decades of stress and struggle. In April of 1935, less than a year after Milky Way Farm's grand opening, less than a year after he'd finished his masterpiece, Frank Mars passed away. He was only 50 years old. The official cause was a heart attack, sudden and final. But those who knew him understood that his heart had been broken long before it stopped beating. Forrest Mars was in Europe when he received the news of his father's death. He came back for the funeral, stood beside the grave, accepted condolences from strangers who knew his father better than he did. The will was read, and Forrest discovered that he'd inherited a fortune. The Mars Company, the Candy Empire, all of it now belonged to him, shared with his father's widow, but essentially his to control. He also inherited Milky Way Farm, the estate his father had built, the dream made solid in Tennessee hills. But Forrest had no interest in Tennessee. He had no sentimental attachment to horses or rolling fields or Tudor manor houses. He looked at Milky Way Farm and saw only overhead, maintenance costs, money tied up in land that produced nothing useful to the candy business. What happened next revealed the depth of the divide between father and son, the gulf that had never been bridged. Forrest sold Milky Way Farm almost immediately, not to someone who would preserve it, not to someone who understood what it meant. He sold it quickly, efficiently, the way you'd sell any piece of property that didn't fit your business plans. The new owners were less interested in maintaining Frank's vision than in making the property profitable. The magnificent horses were sold off. The prize cattle were dispersed. The carefully tended gardens began to grow wild. The workers who'd taken such pride in keeping everything perfect were let go, their cottages standing empty. For decades after, Milky Way Farm passed through various hands, each owner seeing it differently. For a while, it operated as a working farm, though never with the same grandeur Frank had envisioned. The manor house, which had been built to showcase wealth and refinement, became just another old building, its imported marble gathering dust, its carved wood paneling fading. The barns, once the finest in the South, began to show their age. Paint peeled, roofs leaked. The white fences that had stretched across the hills rotted and fell. Nature began the slow work of reclaiming what had been so carefully sculpted. In the 1960s and 70s, the property was used for various purposes. Parts of it were rented out. Some of the land was sold off in parcels. The main house changed hands again and again, each new owner making changes, removing pieces of Frank's original vision, adding their own touches without understanding or caring about what had been there before. The horse barns, those magnificent structures that Frank had built with such care, were repurposed or left to decay. Local people who remembered the glory days would drive past and shake their heads, mourning what had been lost. But the story doesn't end in decay. In the 1990s, new owners purchased the property with a different vision. They saw not just an old farm, but a piece of history worth preserving. They began the slow, expensive work of restoration. The manor house was carefully repaired, its Tudor character restored while updating the interior for modern use. The grounds were cleaned up, the fences repaired, the gardens replanted. The main horse barn, that magnificent structure that had housed Frank's beloved draft horses, was stabilized and restored, becoming a venue for events and weddings. People could once again walk through that wide center aisle and imagine carriages rolling through, could stand in those spacious stalls and picture the powerful horses that once called them home. Today, Milky Way Farm operates as a bed and breakfast and event venue. The manor house welcomes guests who sleep in rooms where Frank once dreamed of hosting his son. The grounds, though smaller than Frank's original 3,000 acres, still showcase the beauty he envisioned. Weddings are held in the barns where champion horses once stood. Visitors walk the same paths Frank walked, though they may not know his story, may not understand the heartbreak and hope that built these walls. The current owners treat the property with respect, understanding that they're not just managing real estate but preserving a piece of American history, a monument to both success and sorrow. But here's the truly dark irony of Milky Way Farm's story. While Frank's estate crumbled and changed hands, while his dream was sold off and nearly forgotten, his candy company thrived beyond his wildest imaginings. Under Forrest Mars's ruthless leadership, the Mars Company became a global empire. Forrest proved to be a business genius, perhaps even more talented than his father, though in different ways. He expanded internationally, created new products, and built Mars Incorporated into one of the largest privately held companies in the world. Today, Mars candy bars are sold in nearly every country on Earth. The company is worth billions, employing thousands, touching millions of lives through chocolate and caramel and nougat. Forrest Mars himself became one of the richest men in America, though he lived modestly and avoided publicity. He married, had children, built his own dynasty. But he rarely spoke of his father. In interviews, when asked about Frank Mars, Forrest's answers were brief, almost dismissive. He acknowledged his father's role in starting the company, but emphasized his own contributions. The expansion and modernization that turned a regional candy maker into a global giant. He never returned to Milky Way Farm after selling it. Never expressed regret for letting it go. Never seemed to understand or care that his father had built it as a bridge between them. A peace offering made of stone and wood and hope. The people who knew both men, the old employees of the Mars Company who worked under Frank and then under Forrest, would tell a fascinating story if you could get them to talk. They'd describe Frank as warm but scattered, a dreamer who cared more about flavor and feeling than about profits and efficiency. They'd describe Forrest as brilliant but cold, a man who could calculate profit margins in his head but couldn't or wouldn't understand human hearts. Frank wanted to be loved. Forrest wanted to be respected. Frank built a candy empire and a Tennessee farm trying to connect with his son. Forrest built a global corporation and proved he didn't need his father at all. There's a deeper tragedy here, one that goes beyond candy bars and real estate. It's the tragedy of two people who spoke different languages, who wanted different things, who could never quite understand each other no matter how hard one of them tried. Frank Mars spent his life overcoming obstacles, his disability, his poverty, his failed marriages, his business struggles. He climbed from nothing to something, from sleeping in train stations to owning one of the finest estates in Tennessee. But the one obstacle he could never overcome was the distance between himself and his son. All the money in the world, all the chocolate and caramel and success couldn't buy back the years when Forrest was growing up without him, couldn't erase the resentment of a boy who felt abandoned, couldn't bridge the gap between a father who wanted love and a son who wanted nothing. And Forrest? He spent his life proving he was better than his father, smarter, more successful, more powerful, and he succeeded. By every measurable standard, Forrest Mars achieved more than Frank ever did. But in proving his superiority, he lost something that perhaps mattered more. He lost the chance to know his father not as a competitor or a failure, but as a man. A flawed, struggling, hopeful man who'd done his best with what life gave him. By the time Forrest was old enough to understand that, Frank was gone, buried in a grave that Forrest rarely visited, leaving behind a farm that Forrest couldn't wait to sell. Walk through Milky Way Farm today, and you'll find it beautiful. The restored manor house glows in the afternoon sun, its Tudor lines elegant against the Tennessee sky. The barns stand proud and clean, hosting celebrations and joy. The fields roll green and peaceful, dotted with wildflowers and ancient trees. But underneath the beauty, if you know where to look, you can still sense the sadness. The dream that was built too late. The reconciliation that never happened. The father who wanted to prove his worth, and the son who never needed the proof. In one of the upstairs rooms of the manor house, there's a window that overlooks the main horse barn and the fields beyond. Frank Mars stood at that window often during the brief time he lived to enjoy his creation. He would stand there in the morning, watching the sun rise over his land, watching workers tend his horses, watching his dream come to life around him. And he would think about Forrest, across the ocean in England, building his own empire, proving his own worth, never looking back. Did Frank understand, in those quiet morning moments, that he'd built Milky Way Farm not for Forrest, but for himself? That the approval he sought wasn't really his son's, but his own? That all the horses and barns and imported marble in the world couldn't fix what had broken between them when Forrest was still a child? We'll never know what Frank thought in those final months. He left no diary, no confession, no explanation of why a candy maker built a palace in Tennessee when he could have built it anywhere, or not built it at all. But the farm itself stands as a kind of answer. It says, I matter. My life meant something. I built something beautiful. And it also says more quietly, I wish you were here to see it. I wish you cared. The workers at Milky Way Farm during Frank's time tell stories passed down through generations. They describe a boss who knew everyone's name, who asked about their families, who paid fair wages during a time when many employers took advantage of desperate workers. They describe a man who would stand for hours watching his horses, a slight smile on his face, finding peace in their massive, gentle presence. They describe someone who seemed lonely even when surrounded by people, who had everything except the thing he wanted most. After he died, some of those workers wept. Not because they'd lost a job, though jobs were precious during the Depression, but because they'd lost someone who'd treated them with dignity, who'd created a place where they could work with pride. When Forrest sold the farm, when he let it go without a second thought, he broke something for those people too. They'd believed they were part of something lasting, that Frank's vision would endure. Instead, they watched it dissolve, sold to strangers who saw only land and buildings, not dreams. Some of them left Tennessee, searching for work elsewhere. Others stayed, found new jobs, but would sometimes drive past the old estate and remember when it had been perfect, when every fence post gleamed white, and every horse was groomed like royalty. The relationship between Frank and Forrest Mars has been studied by business historians and psychologists alike, trying to understand what went wrong, what made two talented men from the same family unable to work together or even speak civilly to each other. Some blame Frank's absence during Forrest's childhood, the years when Frank was struggling and Forrest was being raised by his mother and stepfather. Those early years, they argue, created a distance that could never be fully bridged. Forrest learned to see Frank not as a father, but as an obligation, a name on occasional letters, a source of money but not of guidance or love. Others blame the times. The early 20th century was an era of rugged individualism, when men were taught to be strong and stoic, to hide their emotions and never admit weakness. Frank, for all his creativity and warmth with employees, may not have known how to tell his son what he felt. And Forrest, raised in that same culture, may not have known how to ask. So they communicated in the language they both understood: business. And in business, there's no room for sentiment, no place for apologies or reconciliation. There's only profit and loss, success and failure, winners and losers. But perhaps the simplest explanation is also the saddest. Sometimes people just don't fit together. Sometimes a father and son, no matter how hard one tries or how much the other achieves, simply can't connect. Their personalities clash. Their values diverge. Their very presence irritates something in the other that can't be soothed or fixed. And in those cases, all the money and success and beautiful estates in the world won't matter. The gap remains, and eventually it becomes so wide that no bridge can span it. Milky Way Farm stands as evidence of that unbridgeable gap. Frank built it as a monument to success, yes, but also as an offering, a statement that said, "Look what I've accomplished. Look what I can create. Am I worthy now?"